In our studio today is Dr. Matthew Jones, exhibiting at the Depot Art Space, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. Matthew, marine ecologist. What is a marine ecologist?
Well, a marine ecologist is someone who studies the ecology of either animals or plants or groups of animals. So I study the structure and function of ecosystems. And for me in particular, what interests me are deep sea ecosystems. And if you think of the deep sea, it's basically the largest habitat on Earth.
Right.
So we're talking, I think the last time I checked, it's like 62% of the Earth's surface is covered with water more than a kilometre deep.
Wow.
And if you were aliens from space and you wanted to sample what Earth was like, you wouldn't worry about that sort of dry, crusty bit on the outside. You'd actually go for the deep sea, because it's the largest habitat that we have on planet Earth.
Great. So how does an ecologist relate to or connect with this exhibition here? You've got artwork on the wall, beautiful photographic work. So photographic work, artwork, marine ecologist, what's the connection there?
I think I'd like to sort of highlight the beauty of small things and the relationships we have with animals and habitats. And you know, there's more out there than charismatic megafauna. There's more out there than dolphins and whales. There are, you know, not to run down dolphins and whales, but they're not something that particularly interests me.
Right.
I'm more interested in the sort of structure and function of everything that goes around them.
Right. So one of the things I see from your writings and the artwork here is a real concern about what's actually happening in the sea. Now, most of us are aware of the impact of trawling, you know, overfishing. But the other thing that you're really concerned about is bycatch. Tell us what bycatch is all about. What is your concern about that?
Bycatch is animals and material that you didn't intend to catch. The way that we catch fish in this country is based on what's called the Quota management system, or the QMS. And in that you have quota for a particular species. The whole QMS is what's called a single species management program. So you have quota for one thing. However, when you put a net down and you drag along the bottom, you don't just catch that one thing.
But, I mean, what's this? I mean, when I think of a net, I think of something, you know, like that there that a fish might go into. What sort of nets are these that pick up so much?
Well, to catch fish in really deep water, which is what I'm talking
And
about.
how deep's that?
That's a kilometre deep. So if you want to think about that in visual terms, if you imagine a sky tower, which is 300 metres, put another sky tower on top of that, and another sky tower on top of that.
You're getting there.
That's the kind of depth, and occasionally another sky tower on top of that. So between 3 and 4 sky towers, or if you're in Europe, 3 or 4 Eiffel Towers, because they're about the same size.
Right.
We're talking about those sorts of depths. And so to catch things at that depth, you need great big nets. And sometimes the terrain is quite rough. So not only do you need nets, you need great big strong nets. So these nets can be tens of meters high by nearly, well, dozens of meters across. They have great big round bobbins that go along what's called the ground rope along the bottom, and that gets dragged along the bottom. And to hold the net open, they have these things called trawl doors, which sit on each side of the net, and they get dragged and they pull outwards like this. And the trawl doors are made of iron.
Wow.
Or some kind of steel, and they're about a ton, 2 tons in weight, and they go down the bottom and they get dragged along. So this whole thing gets dragged along the bottom, and it's a big heavy thing, and anything that gets in its path is either cut off or crushed.
Right, so you're picking up a lot of fish swimming, which is obviously more than what you're looking for, and then there's something else going on in the seabed as well.
Yeah, well, anything that gets caught up into the net gets cut off and ends up at the back of the net, getting squashed and crushed and tumbled around. In addition to that, there is a large plume of sediment comes off the back of these things, and this sort of goes up into the water column and then gradually settles down behind the trawl net.
Right, but like when this boat trawler pulls this to the surface and that, I mean, surely they can sort out all the fish there, and those that aren't wanted to be kept can be put back in the water and let go. Is that a possibility?
Yes and no. It's a nice idea, but unfortunately everything from 1,000 metres is dead by the time it gets to the surface. It's killed by the sort of massive change in pressure.
Right.
From, I think, at 1,000 metres there's about 400 atmospheres of pressure, which is 400 times more pressure than at the surface. So if you pull something up from that kind of depth, it's got to go through a massive pressure change. And so everything, and also the temperature of the water at about 1,000 metres is usually about 2 degrees. And up the surface, it can be anywhere up to sort of 10, 20, sort of in summer it can be warmer than that, depending on where you are.
Right.
And so it's a combination of that, plus a lot of things that get pushed into the back of the net, get tumbled around inside the net, get crushed by all the things on top of them as the net comes to the surface, so they don't tend to survive.
Right. So quota management, really, they're going to fish and catch what they want, but on top of that, they're killing a whole lot of other sea life.
Yeah. And we run the risk of destabilizing ecosystems that we don't really understand.
Now, tell me a little bit about this net as it rolls along the bottom of the sea. You, in particular, you've got one artwork there that you've manipulated somewhat called the...
Ah, you're talking about the Alpha-Benthicola.
Yes, I can't quite repeat that, but anyway, yes, so that one, tell me about that. How big is it? How old is it? What's the impact on this particular... Is it animal, you call it?
Yeah, it's a kind of snail. So
Kind of snail.
Or a gastropod, a kind of snail. And they can be up to nearly a foot long.
Right.
That big sort of size. And they only live in one particular part of New Zealand. They don't live anywhere else in the world. And they live between depths of about 500 to about 800 meters of water. And we don't know how long they live for. We don't know how long or how old they are before they can reproduce. We don't know how many there are. And we have some anecdotal knowledge regarding that they don't turn up as much as they used to in the nets.
Right.
But that's about it.
And
we don't know what they eat. We don't know what eats them.
So how do they fit into the ecosystem? I mean, do we know what eats them or what they eat, or what is their place in that whole ecosystem?
We don't really know. They come from a family called Volutes, and there's a group of them that are only found in New Zealand. The term for it is endemic, so they only live here. And we know that they're probably predators, but in terms of what function they perform in the sort of deep sea ecosystem they inhabit, it's pretty much unknown. With the way that things are recorded, like you're lucky to get someone saying gastropod rather than volute, and then or particular species of volute. So we'd never even know how many there were in the first place, because the records that are kept aren't good enough to know.
Right.
Like the identifications that aren't good enough.
So what else is down there besides these like snail things? Is there coral, for example?
Yeah, there's lots and lots of different kinds of coral. They're all very, very vulnerable to being trawled. There are some that get to the size of small trees in quite deep water. So we're talking 1-2 meter high, maybe 3 meter high.
Where there's not even light down there, they still grow there.
Yeah, they grow slightly differently. They don't have the symbiotic algae that corals, say from coral reef kind of corals, have, like say the Great Barrier Reef. And they don't form great big sort of solid reefs, but they do form sort of thickets and little sort of shrubby growths, and these in turn provide habitat and shelter for other animals, or at least did until they got wiped out by deep sea trawling.
Right. You were just mentioning, or we're talking about coral. Now, when we think about coral not at the bottom of the sea, we're thinking of coral, you know, like in the Great Barrier Reef, and the impact of climate warming on that. One of your artworks here, photographs, has a beautiful picture of a sea anemone, and I'm going to try this again, anemone, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Anemone, right. It's one of those challenging ones to get right. Now, there is some concern about the impact of global warming on them, just like there is in coral, is that correct?
Yes, there is. And one of the things that's happened most recently is the large amount of bleaching of the coral reef on the Great Barrier Reef. I think estimates were up somewhere around about 93% of the reef had bleached. And why that is dangerous and scary is that the primary source of food for coral are the symbiotic algae that live within them.
Right.
So it's kind of a trade-off. So like the algae get a place to live inside the coral, and the coral keeps the algae slightly starved. So the algae that lives inside the coral would normally like to produce starches, but the coral keeps them slightly starved, so they produce sugar because the coral likes the sugar. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Right.
And sea anemones are very closely related to corals. They're basically a coral without a skeleton.
Okay.
And many species of sea anemone have these same symbiotic algae within them. And what I'm concerned about, and what a few people are concerned about, is that bleaching has been seen to happen in tropical anemones, but we don't know what the limits are in more temperate waters like New Zealand, because there are some species that live here, and we don't know how much stress they need to be under before they'll start bleaching as well.
Well, do we have any evidence that the temperature of the waters around New Zealand are actually increasing?
Yeah, I think there's sort of general evidence that the temperature around New Zealand is increasing at the same rate as temperature elsewhere.
Which is about?
That's about 1 degree Fahrenheit.
Over what period of time?
Over the last 100 years.
Right, okay. So is that significant then in terms of ecology?
It could be. The thing is, one of the things that happens with these changes is that even though the thing about climate change is that it's happening more rapidly than a natural process, so things have warmed over a sort of 100-year period, or more rapidly, it's still quite a slow process for people to comprehend. So, but we might get to a point where there'll be a tipping point and stuff will happen quite rapidly and we won't be able to stop it.
Right. One of the things that seems to be a concern to me is there are all these things that you observe are happening, but you don't really know how bad it is or how significant it is. It's like a lot of questions. I mean, climate warming is the same. It's pretty much confirmed it's happening, although there's a lot of non-believers. It's like everything that seems to be happening in an ecological way has a lack of clarity of its long-term actual impact on our environment.
There are a couple of things going on there. One of them is, in terms of ecology, in terms of things that aren't commercially exploited, we don't have records that go back very far, and we don't have detailed records. So for a lot of things, we don't know how many there were in the first place.
Right.
And so if we were trying to work out the structure of say, an ecosystem now, we're looking at a degraded ecosystem. Virtually all of the ones around New Zealand are degraded. There's another thing that goes on, and it has an actual name. It's called sliding baselines. And basically what that means is you have a situation where we think what we're seeing now is normal.
Right.
And because changes are happening over our lifespan and we haven't really thought about it, but people have this idea that we look at the oceans now and this is normal, what we see. Like they're kind of empty, they don't really have anything in them. And no, it's not. This is quite a long way from normal.
Right.
I think the last estimate I looked at was that we'd exterminated, I think, 90% of all of the large predatory fish in the ocean.
Now, you're also telling me earlier on today the impact where you remove one particular species in an environment, how that has huge consequences.
Can do. It's what we're talking about here is the concept of what's called a trophic cascade. And that is where you remove, there are unintended consequences of removing or decreasing the numbers of one species.
For example?
There's a good example in ocean ecosystems in the Black Sea. I think it's the Black Sea, where through a combination of factors, all of the predatory fish were overfished to the point at which the fishing industry there collapsed. But what it also did is it meant that normally the larval fish, there'd be so many of them that they would eat all of the jellyfish before the jellyfish got too big.
Right.
But through overfishing and the reduction of fish stocks, there weren't enough larval fish to overcome the jellyfish blooms. And so we had a complete flip in that particular ecosystem where instead of the fish being the dominant predators, the jellyfish became the dominant predators, and now there are more jellyfish eating the baby fish before the fish can grow up. So you now have an ecosystem there that's dominated by jellyfish. So they're the top predator in that ecosystem.
So you're swimming in jelly in the Black Sea.
So basically in the Black Sea it's jellyfish and plankton, and that's what we're worried about. Well, I'm, amongst other marine scientists, are worried about what's going to happen in global oceans if we keep wiping out all the top predators.
Right.
We'll end up with oceans full of jellyfish and plankton and very little else. And slime. Jellyfish, plankton and slime.
Right. Now, one of the other photographs you have there is the picture of a particular animal that's living under the bridge in Tamaki Drive. Is that a troll or something like that you've got growing there, photographing there?
I think one of the things I wanted to highlight with some of the works in this exhibition is there's a lot of beauty in small things. Yeah. And small things that might live pretty much under your nose. And that particular picture is of what's actually called "These Are Not the Hydroids You're Looking For," which is a bit of a Star Wars pun, if you're familiar with that particular scene. But hydroids are a type of coral, again, And these ones I found in a little clump living under a bridge on Tamaki Dry, right under, and they're extremely beautiful animals, but they're not very big.
So we actually have coral in Auckland City under the Tamaki Bridge.
Yep, a kind of coral.
Right.
Not related to coral, not,
Right.
not exactly coral, but
Yeah.
it does the same kind of thing. They live in areas where there's lots and lots of current, and these guys being under those bridge. It's basically the bridge was called Ngāpipi Bridge, and it's the bridge where if you go along Tamaki Drive, it's where the boat houses are.
Yeah.
It's under that bridge. If you go, and there's lots of water going in and out through there. But there's lots of things that are around, just in your sort of local beach area, which are very beautiful if you take the time to sit down and look at them. If you look at any of the high tidal rock pools, you'll see little photosynthetic anemones, and they live up in the high tide, so they only get covered by the tide for maybe an hour every day. So if you think about it, they're supposedly there to catch food going into them. They've only got an hour, you'd think, to get, but they're actually using symbiotic algae to survive in the high tide rock pools.
What's the danger to such sea life, animal life there in Tamaki Drive?
Well, I guess one of them is you've got so many people going in and out with their boats. We have large amounts of sedimentation. Once, what people, this is another sort of sliding baselines thing. New Zealand used to be covered in forest, and if you imagine the three-dimensional structure of a tree and how much water that holds, you take that away and you have concrete in the streets or grass. It doesn't hold as much water, so that water's got to go somewhere. Also, if you dredge harbours, it's kind of like a circular argument. If the harbour was supposed to be that deep, it would be that deep naturally. The fact that you've got to dredge it to keep it that deep means that you've unbalanced a system, and that system is constantly trying to rebalance itself.
Right.
So sand is constantly coming back into the areas that were dredged. So you have all of this stuff going on as well. There's also contaminants that come off roads and contaminants that come off ships.
Right.
Ships are covered with anti-foulant paint to stop things from growing on them, and that leaches into the sediments. We don't really know what it does. All of this stuff does. So a lot of it's having an effect on very, very small things. It might be lethal or sublethal to the larvae of things. And unless you sat down in a lab and sort of worked on particular animals, there's no way of knowing. There's an awful lot of things going on that we don't know about.
Right. Looking at the rest of your artwork out there, Matthew, are there any other particular photographs or works that you've manipulated there that are significant to you, and in what way, if so?
There is one picture there that if you weren't told what it was, you wouldn't guess what it was. And it's a picture I took of the nose of a deep sea fish, and it's taken down a microscope from above. And this little fish is bycatch in orange roughy fisheries, and so it was caught in about 900 meters of water, and it's only about that long.
Right.
And it swims around, and all it really does is it eats snails and clams off the bottom of the sea, and little tiny ones, and worms and stuff. And so it's basically like a little cleaner, goes around cleaning up stuff. They're not worth anything, because they don't get very big. So, but we're wiping them out at quite a enthusiastic rate.
And we don't know who eats them or what their role is.
Well, we know a little bit more about their role, but what eats them, or what would happen if they're not around anymore, we really don't know. And it's sort of unintended. That's what again about trophic cascades. It's sort of unintended consequences.
Right. So how did you come by all these photographs and that, like with that particular creature?
That particular one was part of my PhD research, and I was looking at sort of reconstructing the structure of an ecosystem at 1,000 metres of an area of New Zealand, east of New Zealand, called the Chatham Islands. It's a place called the Chatham Rise, where a lot of commercial fishing goes on. Right. And I was trying to sort of piece together what was known, because we know a lot about the ones that make us money.
Like orange roughy.
Like orange roughy and hoki and all these other ones. But they're not the only things that are down there. And one of the things that's interested me from my research is that one is, okay, so if we've depleted the biomass of orange roughy by about 70 to 80%, presumably there's now 70 to 80% more of the food that orange roughy would be eating if it was there.
Yeah.
But it's not. So what's eating that, if anything at all? The other thing that's come out of that is, okay, so we're taking these fish from 1,000 meters, we're dragging them all to the surface. There can be up to 50 species in a trawl catch. and you're only allowed to catch maybe 1 or 2 of those species, maybe 4 or 5 get retained, the rest of them get kicked over the side. So all of a sudden you have this sort of rain of dead things, and stuff can actually get from the surface to 1,000 meters back down again and sit on the bottom. What's eating that? And if we're wiping out, say, little fish that go around and cleaning up the mess, if we're wiping those ones out, what's left? What's left and what is fulfilling that role in that ecosystem now? And the answer to that is we don't really know.
So once again, is the questions. It's like we're concerned, we see what's happening, but what the consequences are, it's too early to say.
Well, I mean, again, where we look, we've been fishing these things for 30 odd years, and so anywhere we look now is an area which has already been fished. Pretty much everywhere that can be trawled has been trawled. So, and lots of areas which are outside New Zealand's exclusive economic zone, where basically it's the high seas, and there's very little in the way of regulation at all. And there's lots of areas where stuff was fished for 10, 20 years before we even went out there and looked. In terms of science has lagged behind the commercial exploitation consistently.
Actually.
And now we have deep sea mining and deep sea oil exploration to add to those extractive industries. And we don't really know what that's going to do.
Well, I grew up on the Hibiscus coast, and as a kid, we'd go fishing around Arcos Bay, and there'd just be swarms of parkety and sprats. In fact, we'd catch it and cook it on a little fire for breakfast and lunch, you know. And I'll never forget, about 20 years after that, I was out diving around Tiri, and I couldn't get over it. It's just nothing.
Yeah.
There was just nothing. I saw nothing the whole time I was down there.
Yeah.
You know? And all around the coastline there, there's just
nothing.
All the little fish, parkety, mau, oh, what the little, what are those ones called? Not mau. But yeah, all those things were gone.
Yeah, one of the other things that goes on, this is a really good trophic cascade actually, I probably could have mentioned this, is something what is called a kinner barren. And I don't mean barren as in, I mean a barren area. Because you wipe out the predatory fish, all the kinner have nothing to eat them. So they all explode in numbers, and you get lots and lots of kinner, and they wipe out all the kelp. So you don't get kelp forests anymore. And it's one of the first things that happened when they made Goat Island Marine Reserve happen.
Oh, yeah.
The first thing they realised was that all the predatory fish came back, the kinner number went down, and the kelp came back. And the kelp provides habitat for baby fish.
Ah, yes.
Oh, that's one of the pictures I have, the habitat one. Which is about seagrass. And seagrass provides habitat for baby snapper about this big, and trevally and a bunch of other things. But that's, they hide out in that. You take that away, they've got nowhere to hide. It's one of the things I think might be happening in the deep sea as well, because you've got, the juvenile fish have to go somewhere. You take away all of the three-dimensional complexity out of an area, they've got nowhere to hide, they just get munched. Well, but if there's anything there to munch them. That's one of the other things that's also going on.
Yeah.
That recent report that came out in April about the dumping of fish, that was pretty damning. And that we've been misreporting the amount of fish that have been caught by about 2.7. There's like more than 2.5 times more fish being caught than we've been reporting over the last 30 years.
So what they've been doing with them, just dumping them back. So even for orange roughy, for example, catching more than they should, then getting rid of it so that there's just the right amount left.
Well, the way the QMS works is that if you don't have quota for something, there's more that goes on with that as well. And say, for example, you have a quota for hoki, but it takes you the same amount of time to fillet a hoki this big as it does to fillet a hoki this big.
Right.
You only get a fillet that's like that big out of the little one, but it takes the same amount of time. Or I'm simplifying dramatically here.
Ones, keep the big ones.
And that's actually a thing. It's called high grading. You're not allowed to do it. It's illegal, but it still happens. That's a big concern. And that's a general function that's a general failing of the design of the QMS. Of single species management programs. That's
right. Have you been to sea on those fishing trawlers and on the Niwa? No.
I've been out with Niwa.
Right.
But not with. I wouldn't want to go out with a fishing trawler. I'd end up over the side dead. I'd say the wrong thing and be in trouble. But I've had material given to me by Niwa, so I'm very grateful for, and I've had material given to me by the Scientific Observer Program, to whom I'm also very grateful to. yeah, what I did wouldn't have been possible. My subject ended up being very political when I was doing my PhD. And basically I was given, about 2 pallets of fish, about that high. And it's like, here you are, do something with that, you're not getting any more. And the guy that got me them had to pull a whole lot of favours to get them at all.
Wow.
Because there is a general perception within the industry that they do not want research to happen. Because they perceive that, I don't like saying they, it's like ubiquitous, they're out to get you. But the perception was research equals cutting quota. And so the less. So some of the stuff I did,
yeah.
We'd been fishing orange roughies since the mid-late 1970s, and I was the first person to look at them, and I was looking in 2005, 2004.
And what did you find?
I found that there's quite a large amount of interrelation between species. I found that I didn't have enough, that I needed to look at things a lot more carefully, and that basically I was just scratching the top of that particular subject. So I mean, in a perfect world, I'd like to get more fish, cut up more fish, see what they've been eating. It's like having little presents. You sort of cut them up and go, well, what am I going to find? Ooh, if you're that way inclined.
Right. And that tells you something about the ecology.
Yeah, it tells you, and you're looking at stuff that probably no one's ever looked at before. I mean, and I was just going, little crustacean, new species number something or other, and half things I sent off to get identified for various experts around the world came back as new species number 1 through 40. It was like that. Everything didn't have a name yet. Yeah, I've often wondered, because as a shell collector, you go along and see, after a storm and you get a wash up of shells, and you think, how has the composition of that changed? Because you've got all these things living in the sediment off a beach, say off Mount Maunganui, and you find certain things and you get used to finding certain things. It's like, okay, well, what would this be like if all the big fish were still there? Would I be seeing the same things washing up on the beach? How many of these things that I'm seeing are here because there's nothing to eat them anymore? Yeah. And I look at a lot of ecosystems, marine ecosystems, and that's almost one of the first questions I think to myself. What would this be like if this wasn't a heavily degraded ecosystem? And the saddest thing is people don't realise that these are heavily degraded ecosystems, heavily impacted from a myriad of things.
Yeah. Whereas we think, as you say, it's normal. Yeah. Because that's how we've already seen it. Yeah. Unless we've been around for 50 years and we know what it was like previously.
Yeah, very much so. And people are growing up thinking, yeah, exactly, this is normal. The oceans are empty. They don't have anything in them. And
you don't go out fishing anymore and catch any fish.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line at the end of this is we end up with an ocean full of jellyfish, plankton, and slime.
Wow. Thank you. That's a good finishing point.